Well, welcome back to this episode of Beyond the Band-Aids. I am Dr. Carol Engel-Enright. I'm the academic kind of researcher, and today I'm the community member, and I'm going to go around and have Mike and Kristin introduce themselves, and then we'll come back and talk about part two of a three-part talk about culture.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Mike Butler. A little bit of background. I was the former public safety director in the city of Longmont, overseeing police and fire emergency management services. I left that position a few years ago. I'm one of the co-founders of SOSIS, the School of Statesmanship, Stewardship, and Service, along with Carol, and I'm also on the Law Enforcement Action Partnership Board that the LEAP is sponsoring this podcast, and so proud to be part of that. And so welcome and look forward to today's conversation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristin Daley. I'm the executive director of New Blue, which is a national incubator for police community collaboration. I'm also a board member of LEAP and former staff member as well. And I am a credentialed victim advocate for domestic violence and sexual assault and train police on trauma-informed best practices for their departments.
All right. So today we're here beyond the Band-Aids, and beyond the Band-Aids, just a reminder, means that we're not going to address police and community issues at the surface level. We're going to go deep, holistically, into what has brought us to this point. I was doing some research on organizations and thinking about how organizations are formed. And police organizations and municipal organizations are all formed out of the need to organize, to bring together. For police, it was we talked about some of the history of policing and how that culture was brought about. But within each community is a law enforcement agency that keeps the civility going between communities and citizens. Let's talk about the citizens today. And I do want to thank the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, LEAP, for the sponsorship of this, of making this podcast happen, and financially, and that they have worked for years in terms of bringing this conversation, this bridge between community and police departments together. We can talk about where the divide happened, but really it's the evolution of people in communities and how organizations develop. Mike I can say he's an expert in organizational development as we work with communities and now police departments. But today we're going to focus on communities. And I, as a community member, have been, I live in Longmont. I have lived in Longmont since 1993. So 25 years. And it is a community where you don't have to worry about your safety. I had to think this week as we were preparing for this show, what does it mean to live in an unsafe community? What would that feel like? And so we're going to talk today about how communities thrive when there is a healthy sense of safety and belongingness and well-beingness, and a wonderful partnership with police, so that when something goes wrong, there is somebody in the background to help. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you, what is a healthy, and we're going to talk about dependence to interdependence. In this three-part, what does a healthy interdependent community actually look like in practice?
Well, thank you. And that's the essence of this. And by the way, that's the essence of Beyond the Band-Aids. We certainly want our police departments to be operating effectively and efficiently. And this is, as you said, Carol, this is the second of a third part. And in the third part, we're going to talk about what a healthy relationship looks like between police and community. The first part was about what a healthy police department looks like that's operating in a way that's being recommended by Project PACT, which is the name of our organization, so to speak, that's also supporting this Beyond the Band-Aids podcast. But the community piece is ground zero. That's where we need to be focused, and everything needs to be focused on what a healthy community can look like. So, there's a lot of different descriptors of a healthy neighborhood, and you nailed one of those, from dependency to interdependency, where people feel this sense that their voice counts, their thoughts matter. They sense that, one of the things that we realized when in our work in neighborhoods and in our community, where people believed that they were enough and that they had the capacity to bring about change, and that they had this sense of belonging that you mentioned, that belonging that says, I belong to this neighborhood, or I belong to this community. And oh, by the way, this community belongs to me, or this neighborhood belongs to me. Those are all aspects of what a healthy community looks like. There's not a sense of competition as much as there's a sense of cooperation, and things are organized around being cooperative. There's a sense that these people can engage anytime. There's little to no deferment or delegation. People would rather call a neighbor than call the police or their municipal government. They know their neighbors. They understand who their neighbors are. They really they have a sense for their lifestyle. They choose accountability, by the way. There's this essence of chosen accountability versus it being demanded. There's not this overly preoccupation with leadership or with who our elected officials are or what they do and how they do it. Those are not signs of a healthy community. It's not that we don't want competent elected officials. It's just that the preoccupation with them lessens dramatically. There's a sense that, we're not so much, well, if we're going to if we're going to try to heal our woundedness, we need to be more dependent on oversight and laws and legislation. There's not that. There's a sense of, we have that capacity. And as I said earlier, we're enough. We have this aspect to ourselves that we can draw close to our neighbors. We can galvanize our neighbors. We can work in cooperative and organized ways to help heal our woundedness. We don't necessarily need to call on systems or corporations or the experts or the leaders necessarily. It's not that they can't be a part of this. It's just that that's not always our first default way of how we're going to respond. And so it's in essence, I just want to kind of end this by saying there is this sense that we have more than enough to be able to resolve the issues that we have. We have more than enough to be able to create a different kind of future. We can also participate in the economy, and we can grow ourselves. We can make our streets safe. We can help educate a child. We can do all those things that we want to be able to do. Those are all tenets of abundancy. And there is that sense of abundancy, not that sense of scarcity. There's that sense of that we have all of this and that there's plenty for everybody. And so there's this, and then lastly, I'll just say that there's a sense that, I belong to something that's the whole that's greater than the sum of all of the people here and all of the parts that are here. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I look forward to more conversation in this arena.
Okay. Well, we've got a lot to dive into. So, unhealthy dependency, Kristin. I know you're working with a lot of different individuals in forward-thinking kind of police departments that are working to bring community solutions together. What are some of the things that you're hearing about unhealthy dependency? And I want to dive into this a little bit because if I'm a community member listening to what Mike just said, I went, well, that's all fine and good. I'd love my neighborhood to look like that. But, I know if I go knock on a door, that person, we might have some divisions that we categorize each other with. And how do we find unity in a divided, I don't want to use the word politics, but I'm going to, in a divided political, it happens in every neighborhood, people point fingers or get into squabbles over whatever. How do we bring that together?
So I think there are a couple of different ways to approach that. First of all, we want to work toward a shared model of public safety that's really collaborative between police and community. But I think what an unhealthy system for public safety would look like is it could go one of two ways. It could go with a community that's really, as Mike talks about a lot, over-reliant on their police department, expect them to do everything, solve everything, be the responder for every situation. Or it could be a community where people are afraid to call the police because they've had bad experience or their community has been over-policed or, disproportionately engaged with the police department in a negative way. So those two different types are both unhealthy. We don't want people to be afraid of interaction with their police department because that's a barrier to collaboration, clearly. We also don't want people to be over-reliant to the point that they themselves are disengaged with what their community needs and what well-being looks like. So I would say we have to start by building a system that's really rooted in mutual respect, accountability, and transparency. We have to make the most vulnerable people in our communities feel not just heard, but really valued, and that their safety and well-being is prioritized. And we have to work toward that system, we have to build trust. So you can't build trust without being willing to get really authentic about communication and extend that same opportunity to others and have compassion for each other's points of view and challenges. And then once we get that communication going about the challenges and the barriers, we have to be ready to move forward with a new understanding in place of what we collectively want, what we are going to work towards, how we are going to remove those barriers that are dividing us politically or otherwise, and how we're going to address power imbalances, how we're going to create spaces where all stakeholders are empowered. I think that shift is already happening. Certainly with the officers that we work with at New Blue, we have seen them breaking down communication barriers, really diving in deep with their communities and looking at what they want, what they need, what kind of systems can we build to create a more productive, a safer, a better place to live. And I think we have to keep that momentum going. We can't be put off course by the roadblocks. We have to push through them.
Okay, so we talked last week with Neil Gross about the author of Walk the Walk, about how certain police departments have been able to shift the culture. And I just want to bring up, as the researcher, and I'm going to bring up a couple of things that I think are maybe new terms to listeners. In terms of culture, understanding that it's not fixed. It is dynamic. It is based on beliefs and lifestyles. And so, Kristin, you talked about two sides of the barriers, one where they're afraid of the police and one where they're afraid of taking on responsibility. In both cases, I heard fear. Fear is what's stopping a lot of our culture. Our culture wants to shift. It seems that the community wants to be more interdependent and connected with each other. Society, civilization wants that. But fear is holding us back. So, Mike, when fear appeared in your police department, whether it was with the police themselves or with the police interfacing with community, how did you get people to a point of, I guess I'm going to say, courage, or being willing to step into or to go into uncertainty, and start to make the connections, the social connections that lead to transparency and trust and mutual respect?
Well, we talked about some of this already in terms of the shift that needed to occur within a police department prior to it occurring between the police department and the community. And so, in essence, and we also shifted this idea that I didn't need to be as the chief, everybody's dad or patriarch, or the sense that their life was very dependent on my decisions. And so we gradually, over time, and you used the word earlier, evolved. We evolved that aspect of that relationship from one of people being, unhealthily dependent on top management in an organization to one of them feeling interdependent with each other, and the sense that they were enough and that they didn't need to necessarily rely on the management of the organization for the quality of their work experience, if you will. But that took a lot of conversations, and we're going to talk about the nature of conversations and the kind of conversations we can have that can help bring about that sense of identity, that kind of commitment, that level of chosen accountability, and to be able to take action in ways that maybe they didn't feel like they could or believed that they could. So for some people, probably just a few people, they could jump into the deep end with both feet and felt like they could swim right away. And there was very little issue with some people. Most people had to kind of tiptoe into this. And there was a little bit of trial and error and kind of testing the water, if you will, to see if it was going to be comfortable enough for them. Because as we know, going from a sense of I used to be dependent on somebody to now I want to have to be more independent to interdependent with myself and others, that's a process for each individual. That's something that has to take place within the person themselves. It's not something that another person can do for another person. So all I could do is to create an environment in which if you made a mistake or if you got something wrong, that your job wasn't on the line or that you weren't going to be disciplined necessarily. We'll talk about that essence of how we brought that about later. But they were comfortable enough to see that if they got it wrong or if they made a mistake, that it served that mistake and maybe failure served more as an educational episode and not necessarily something that there was severe consequences for. So people got used to experimenting, trying, moving out of their comfort zone, moving into areas that were less familiar or maybe felt less safe. And so once they got out of that little maybe box they were in and started expanding their wings and kind of flying a little bit higher and seeing that they weren't going to crash and burn, then it was one of those evolutionary processes for each person as we went. And so one of the things that I want to make real clear here is that evolutionary process in any organization, especially police, it's going to take time. There's a marathon aspect to it. There's no sprint involved here. And so you're, as the chief or as top management in an organization, you're going to have to see people kind of come and go, kind of maybe relapse a little bit, get back into it. And so all of that was part of the process, if you will, to help people see that that their voice counted, that their thoughts mattered, they could make decisions, that they could exercise authority that they didn't know they could exercise. But we also did things along the lines of changed a lot of our systems and a lot of our management systems, including the architecture. One of the things we did in our architecture was we flattened the organization. And by flattening the organization, we gave each and every person more decision-making authority. And so once we did that, and that was a 2 to 3, 4-year process, and once we did that and people felt this level of comfort, they could begin to see what it was like to work in partnership with top level of the organization, not be a subservient person or kind of work for a patriarch or a benevolent dictator, however you want to say it, that wasn't where they were at. They were said, Butler's a partner with me. And I can really work with that, and I can make mistakes, and I can disagree with him. I can voice my dissent, my doubts, my reservations. I can express my own sense of possibilities. I can say no to an invitation, whatever that might look like over time. But what they began to see then was this sense that that's how I can be with people in the community. Because police departments are very much patriarchs with the community. And so if we're going to talk about bringing that kind of healthy community to life, A police department, again, has this incredibly legitimate platform, more than any other municipal department in any city, because they're out there 24/7 in the community, every aspect of every neighborhood, to be able to help bridge that gap and help the community and the citizens themselves evolve from that sense of dependency, that interdependency. And by the way, they just experienced it within their own organization. And they sensed that they can do it themselves. And so they got the sense that others can do it as well. Because that's the part for each of us to have to understand, is that because we're citizens and because we're police officers shouldn't make any difference in terms of whether or not our voice counts and our thoughts matter. It's a level playing field everywhere. And so the question is sequence, and the question is, how do we create that level playing field where people can either jump into the deep end, or if they need to tiptoe, they can tiptoe.
Yeah. Okay. So police are citizens too. I got that out of there. And a policeman may know more about your own neighborhood than you as a resident in your neighborhood. Is that true?
Often, very, very much often. Because one of the things that you asked, Kristin, one of the hallmarks of an unhealthy dependency or an unhealthy community is the sense of people feeling disconnected, the sense of people feeling isolated, this sense of being alone, the sense that they don't know if they're enough. They don't know any. And so there's this default towards, I got to call 911. Or I got to call the police if something's going on in my neighborhood versus calling a neighbor. And so there's a sense of, I've been educated, schooled, and trained to call the experts, to call the system, to call the professionals, to call the police or someone. They've been trained to do that. And that's an aspect that we got to get really serious and honest about in terms of how government is in their communities. We need government. We need leadership. We just need it to show up differently. That's how Project PACT is presenting this, in a way that strongly recommends and suggests that people and that citizens have that capacity to kind of rearrange themselves and for their voice to count and their thoughts to matter in a way that they can help be part of the solutions that are going on in the community.
Okay. So, Kristin, you brought up the word create, and we're going to introduce co-creation. It's very near and dear to my heart because that's my entire academic research is in co-design and co-create. I just want to go through that it's a collaborative approach. It creates mutually valued outcomes. So if the community, and I was asking Mike earlier today, can a community actually change a police department? Can they effectively change? Now, I'm going to preface this by, we all know there are community activists out there. And we know community connectors, people that link one neighbor to another. Tell me about some of the projects where creation has happened. And I know you're working with community organizations with some of your police officers. How this co-creation process, and I want to talk through the design process, because so often we identify a problem and then we go to fix a problem or come up with a solution for the problem. We never talk about what we really want. What is it we're after? What's the vision of what we want to create? So can you kind of talk about how some of the work you're doing or have done in the past creates this ecosystem of something that doesn't exist yet, that's being created in real time together?
Well, I think you nailed it. It starts with asking the community what they really want and what they really need. So all of our fellows work directly with community co-collaborators to create their capstone projects. And that process starts with talking to the community, potentially surveying the community, but it could be an informal conversation as well, and digging into what is working well, what's not going right, what would you like to see, and what is the kind of process of elimination to get down to this one idea, which will become their capstone project. And I think, it's clearly starts on the fellows side with selecting the community partner that they want to work with. And that tends to be a community organization or an individual person that they've had past experience with. Sometimes it's a social worker. Sometimes it's someone who runs a grassroots organization around, say, restorative justice. But it's someone deeply ingrained in this process from the community side. They have a conversation. They start to work through what's something that could be really impactful here. And they start to dig into what is the issue, what is the potential solution or policy change or change in practice that the agency could implement, and how do we create this in a way that takes what the police want to see, what the community want to see, and make that the same thing. So, for example, shared vision, exactly. So right now we have our current cohort of fellows working to narrow down exactly what their pitch will become for this project. And we have actually the chief and assistant chief of Waco, Texas, both are fellows in the program, and they are working with community members to create a project around getting officers more invested and informed in the cultural groups in the community, getting really knowledgeable about different stakeholders. What do they need? What do they want to see? How can we create a system where officers and community members are deeply engaged, are communicating with each other at all times, are culturally sensitive and aware of what the other person wants and needs. That's a great example, I think, because it can reflect a number of things. It can reflect the needs of crime survivors or people who are struggling with substance use or people who are struggling with mental health. It can also just reflect the needs of the average community member who doesn't have a specific want for what the police should know about them, but could if they get into a deeper conversation. We also have programs around building like a restorative justice court. So what do officers need to fully participate in that process? What do community members need from officers if they are to participate? There's a wide range of what the project itself could look like, but it all comes down to how do we build community trust with the police agency?
And connecting this, working together, which is what we're all about. Mike, I know you've got so many examples of creating and co-creating with community. I want to ask you, when you first brought community in, who showed up? Who showed up to want to work with the police, and how were they invited, and how did you make that happen? Because I think so many community members just don't know where to start.
Yeah, you're right. The police department can look like a kind of a large fortress, if you will, and impenetrable sometimes in the eyes of people in the community. And the only way you can really talk to them is by dialing 911 or whatever that might look like. And so there's a lot of that kind of relationship that exists. And so breaking down that kind of faceless fortress-like mindset and that impenetrableness can be a process for a police department in terms of saying, how do we create this environment and culture where we're inviting people into our midst? And so that took a while. But I went out into the community like a lot of police chiefs do. They're invited to meetings, they're invited to service clubs, they're invited to all kinds of events. And when you're introduced, at those events, or when you're asked to speak, I always formed my presentation. In fact, every presentation I've done in my career as a police chief, or even since then, has been in the form of an invitation. Always an invite to become engaged, to become involved, to call, to talk, whatever that might be. And at first, people were a little bit, well, we've heard this before. But then, this tiptoeing process, some people jumped in. Typically, the people who showed up right away were the activists, were the people who always showed up before. And most communities you go to and you say, well, let's have a community meeting, the same people show up. And that you'll hear that from people in the community. The same people show up. Well, we wanted more people to show up. We wanted people to show up that felt marginalized or felt that they were kind of ostracized or didn't know whether or not they had any voice at all. And so we had to work on that. And so we did a lot of door to door. We did a lot of just showing up at various other meetings and groups and organizations, making ourselves known. There's a lot that went into that aspect of it that I can talk about another time in terms of how we reorganized our entire operations division in a way that did just exactly what we're talking about. Oftentimes, operations divisions are designed around calls for service or response, effective and efficient response to criminal investigations. And those are things that are important. I don't want to minimize that because that is important. People want, when they need the police to be there in a life or death or an emergency, they want them there as fast as they can. But we also included how can we carve out time for our operations people to become more engaged and more engaged in doing things in the community. And so we had to reorganize a lot of how we did our service delivery system in the community. And so that's a topic for another conversation. But then ultimately, as I said before, when we got to the point where we were doing a long-range strategic plan for our police department, we had 800 people from our community show up. And out of 1,000 people that were involved, that took some time. And by the way, then you had to create, it's not just, well, okay, I showed up. Now what do we do? We had to create the culture and environment and the way of doing business that not only did I show up, but I realized that what I say means something. And people are listening to me. And my voice counts. It really does. And so we had to make sure that atmosphere existed for people so that they would come back. Not only come back, but that they would choose to be accountable. They would choose a level of commitment. They would choose to be part of how we implement our strategic plan by taking actions. And so all of those things are kind of evolutionary over time, but your mindset and your sense of who you are as an organization over time has to shift and change. And then people begin to say, well, this is who they are. I can actually be at their meetings. I actually show up at their internal meetings. I'm part of their discipline committee. I help select police officers. I help promote police officers. I am part of all of these things, aspects. It almost becomes part of how you do business. It's a way of being. But it takes a while for that to happen. And part of what we teach at Project PACT is that aspect of here's a sequence, here are the steps, here are the things you need to be doing in order to shift and change your culture so that your culture becomes just exactly what we're talking about. Because ultimately, as we said at the beginning of this podcast, this is not about you, the police department. This is about what's going on in our community. Does the community believe and feel like they're enough? Do they believe and feel like they can take charge, that they don't have to delegate or defer, that they can choose these things to help heal the woundedness in their community? That's ultimately where we want to be. Are they feeling more interdependent, or are they just shut down? And then because someone from government is there to say, well, if you need us, call us, we'll be there, or you'll be better because we know better, which is often the mantra. So it's a process. It takes time. And sometimes it's one person at a time, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so shared vision. I want to get back to shared vision in co-creating an interdependence between community and law enforcement, or the people who uphold a civil society. Sometimes I think I look at how the police have to act, almost like how doctors have to act. Most people walk in, they're sick, find what's wrong with me and fix it. police, find what's wrong with our community and fix it. Get these criminals out of here. Instead of what I'm hearing you say is, Mike, is that you brought everybody together. You brought these diverse perspectives together. You brought expertise. You brought it from outside of the organization. You didn't have to guard this culture. This is who we are. This is who we've always been. You let change happen. You let other insight come in, which is part of the co-creation process, the design process, which leads to, from the research, leads to increased innovation, improved customer satisfaction, so increased citizen satisfaction. Imagine if your town, all of a sudden, everybody's very, very happy instead of everybody's talking about all the problems. Imagine that. And then stronger interconnected relationships. So, Kristin, let's talk about the culture that co-creation can bring. What you've heard about the relationships from some of your officers and what it does for their own job satisfaction within the police department. Their sense of I'm making a difference. I'm here to serve. I'm here to help, and it's actually happening. And then on the other side, how the community is okay. I don't have to fight all the time. I don't have to resist the police. I can work for this shared vision, this something to be created.
Yep. Well, within the agency, I think it starts with having a leader, the kind that Mike described, who is not keeping kind of a stranglehold on thoughts and ideas and what comes out of the work. So it's a leader that is open to change and a leader that encourages people to think outside the box, to not be afraid to make mistakes, to take initiative and build programs and build relationships and to engage with each other. So that's what drives that type of change within a police agency. And then when you empower officers of all ranks to take that sort of responsibility and to, think about it. So if you're told you're going to implement this program this way and don't deviate from this plan, do you really feel invested and engaged and like it's your responsibility? You're just following orders. But if you're told, what do you see in this program? How can you change it to make it the best it can be? How can you really lead it and make it something great? Then you feel like it's yours. It belongs to you. It belongs to everyone. And you're invested in implementing it in a way that will make it most successful. So I think that's what that type of leader instills in their officers. And then that expands out into the community. And the same principle kind of applies. If communities are told, this is kind of a patriarchal environment. The police are at the top of the chain and you will obey the rules. They don't feel invested in the outcomes and they don't feel driven to get involved. But if you tell them, this is our community, we want to work with you, we want to build a partnership, we want you involved and invested in the programs that we're putting out there, then they take ownership and want to be involved and want to carry out implementation in a really impactful way.
Yeah, Mike, I want you to talk in some of our school statesmanship classes. We've had people walk in that have worked with you in the past, definitely in the police department. They were volunteers. They were citizens. They became very active in their citizenship. And they speak about the rewards that they had as they worked with the police department. Can you think of any examples and speak to what it does for community when they can actively be involved in working on innovative solutions? I'm going to call it that.
Yeah, sure. There are hundreds, thousands of those examples. And by the way, they showed up at our staff meetings and they were part of the agenda. And I remember this couple. I won't name them, but I have a vision of them in my head around who they are. They came in and this was early on, very early on, and they tiptoed into the room, and they were the only citizens in the room. It was a room of 40, 50 police people, including the public safety director and the command staff, and so anyway, it was potentially an intimidating environment for them. But they weren't intimidated, and they came in and they said, we'd like to put together a citizen patrol program. And they had this idea of how citizens in the community could become the eyes and ears of police, and in the neighborhoods and on the streets and in parks and in certain business districts. And so they came in with this idea that they actually found out of a community in Florida. Delray Beach was the name of the community. And because we ended up going there, we ended up sending citizens to that community to find out how they put their program together and how they built it and how they sustained it. And so this couple came in with this idea, and and everyone they took about 15 minutes to present the idea, and everyone kind of looked at each other and said, well, what do we do now? Because we've never had citizens come in and suggest something like this. And this is the staff was very unused to this kind of arrangement. And so, but somebody on our staff has said, I think that's a brilliant idea. It wasn't me that said this. It was someone willing to jump into the deep end with both feet. I think that's a brilliant idea. And I'd love to be the point person for that program. And so I'm just sitting back saying, of course, this is brilliant. Of course, we're going to be able to surface and activate and coordinate social capital in a way that we haven't been able to do it before. I got people from the community willing to organize the community. I got people in the police department willing to help train these folks and be a point person and coordinator. And so it's kind of like ready-made for me in terms of all I have to do is say, go forth. I invite you to come back in a month and tell us what progress you've made and what you need. And it ended up being a very, very robust program, including hundreds of citizens and people from all walks of life, including people who worked, didn't work. We had to figure out how to find transportation for them, how to find uniforms, how to organize. And I know some people in the police departments that are watching this because this was something we did back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so by then it wasn't all that catchy, but it's now kind of something that I think some police departments are doing more of. So anyway, it was one of those great ideas that surfaced from the community. And so brilliance, and I've always said, brilliance can come from anywhere. You don't need officially sanctioned rank to have brilliance. You don't need to be a police officer to understand, here's how police departments can operate more effectively, or here's how we can make our community safer, maybe is the better question. And by the way, I just want to alert people that on Project PACT, there is an article that Peter Block and I wrote called Safety in Our Own Hands. And so if you wanted some real fine-tuned detail about how this can play out in your organization, your community, read that. It's a 35-page kind of piece of work, but it goes through a lot of steps in terms of what you need to do in order to get to the point we're talking about with your community. But that's the example that comes to mind for me right away.
Beautiful example. Really beautiful. And while you're saying that, I'm thinking of, there's the naysayers out there. What happens if a citizen walks into a real criminal situation? What do? I'm sure you put all of those practices in place.
Let me just say that for everything you do, there's going to be a level of resistance. And police chiefs know this. Everyone kind of knows that there's going to be your share of cynics, your share of victims, and your share of bystanders. And you just have to overcome and move forward. Everyone has a what if question with everything that's new. The cynics have been burned before. The victims feel helpless, and the bystanders say, show me it works somewhere else, or give me the data to suggest that it works. That's a great line for bystanders is, I want data that it works somewhere else. I want data. So anyway, those things always happen. And we get that, we understand that. And so So yeah, those things occur. But if you're going to move in the direction that we're talking about with Project PACT, you're going to have to put up with a tad of resistance from going from that patriarchal mindset to a partnership mindset.
I love the thought of brilliance, bringing light to something, and that's how change. That's how evolution happens. That's how we create safer, more whole communities that are good for the whole, that take the whole into consideration as you move forward. I want both of you to just as we start to wrap this up, maybe give some tips on how community members every day, the average Joe or Josephine citizen like me, how can we make a difference for safety in our community?
I think it starts with talking with your neighbors, talking with the people that you're immediately connected with day to day, starting to become more aware of what policies and practices are happening in your own community that either build trust and, build community and build well-being, or are detrimental to it. And what can you do to amplify what is good and to change what is not going so well? And then I think it expands from that small group of people into a larger group. It's, it can start with, like Mike talked about, starting to attend meetings in your community, starting to attend city council meetings or meetings that the police department holds or community groups, putting yourself out there, not being so isolated and in your bubble of what's going on with me, and thinking bigger, thinking about the entire community as an us. It's not us versus them. It's not just me. It's us. And I think that is one of the things that we're probably all most proud of with Project PACT, is that it's very much focused on us and breaking down barriers and removing divides and getting every community member to feel like this is their community, take ownership, take responsibility, and get out there and make a difference, make an impact.
Well said. I just want to say thank you, Kristin, for all those. That was beautifully said. I also want to talk about the dynamic of associational life, that every community has a level of associational life. And sometimes it's found in your service clubs. Sometimes it's found in, meetings at the school district. Maybe your kids go to schools. There's all these things that you have connections to, that if you become a member of a Rotary Club or an Optimist Club or some kind of service club, there's all kinds of animal names out there, moose, elks, whatever out there that you can become members of. And I don't mean to minimize any of that, because those are all helpful clubs. Just the animal name kind of serves as a memory reminder, so to speak. Or if your kids go to schools, become part of a PTA or whatever that might look like, whatever the school has going for you. Those are initial steps. Maybe if you're a tiptoeer, sometimes maybe you walk a neighborhood, and you walk a neighborhood by saying, someone's outside, I just may say hello to them. I just may say, hey, I'm so-and-so, I live in your neighborhood. You can assess those circumstances. For those who jump in the deep end, go make a meeting with your police chief and just say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about some things in terms of what things we can do, some things we can do better. And then there's that continuum of tiptoe to the people jumping in the deep end. Wherever you find yourself on that continuum or spectrum, take a step forward. And there's all kinds of things you can do to kind of become, because there's not one person that's listening to this that doesn't want to have some meaning and purpose in their life. And we can talk about the offline people and the online people. I know Carol told me about a study recently, or an article she read, that the real relationships are made offline. They're the personal connections that we have. Start making those relationships happen. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And so sometimes it may start online. Sometimes it may say, are you willing to meet somewhere if you know somebody or something like that? But let's go offline, folks. Let's get personal. And let's make friends where we don't have to put a like on the computer screen. Let's make friends where we can buy a cup of coffee for somebody. And so let's start doing those kinds of things. That's what we're talking about. Everybody wants to do that. And so whether you're a tiptoe or jump into the deep end person, somewhere you can find something to begin that process of connecting and de-isolating and making friends and doing something that's helpful for your community.
Beautiful. And I'm going to wrap it up by being from a design background, looking always for how to get to the creative side of a brain. And it, for me, and what I recommend, it always comes with a thank you. So as a community member today, I'm going to reach out to some people in the police department and thank them, because I do live in a safe and healthy community. And maybe they don't get a thank you all the time. So if you're a community member out there, maybe you'll take action today to just give gratitude for what can be and for the shared vision that we all have. Make it all good. Thank you for listening today. Thank you for tuning in. We hope you'll rate us and go to the website, sign up for the newsletter, which is coming out very, very soon. And just thank you for listening. Beyond the Band-Aids. Goodbye.